The rain in Washington, D.C., doesn't wash things clean. It just makes the dirt slicker. It was a Tuesday in November. The kind of morning where the sky hangs low and gray like a bruised rib. The downpour hammered against the endless rows of white marble headstones in Arlington National Cemetery. To the tourists, this place is a monument. To the politicians on Capitol Hill, just across the river, it is a photo opportunity. But to the men and women buried here, it is the end of the line. A lone figure stood in section 60. She wore a heavy, dark surplus trench coat, the collar turned up against the biting wind. A worn black baseball cap pulled low over her eyes. The rain ran off the brim in a steady stream, masking the tears she didn't have left to cry. She stared down at the pristine white marble slab at her feet. Vance, Sarah E. Chief Petty Officer, U.S. Navy. 1992 to 2024. Killed in action. Sarah, Raven. Vance traced the engraved letters with a scarred, calloused thumb. It was a strange, hollow feeling to look at your own grave. She was supposed to be under that grass. The United States government, the Navy, the President himself, they all believed she was rotting in a shallow, unmarked hole 5,000 miles away. They had buried an empty casket with full military honors. A folded flag for a sister she didn't have. A 21-gun salute for a ghost. A sudden clap of thunder rolled across the Potomac River. The sound vibrated in Sarah's chest, deep and concussive. In a fraction of a second, the cold Virginia rain disappeared. The gray sky vanished. Suddenly, she wasn't in Arlington anymore. She was back in the suffocating, blood-soaked heat of the Syrian desert. 18 months earlier, Operation Red Dust. The temperature was 112 degrees in the shade. But there was no shade. Just blinding, bleached rock and the pulverized dust of a ruined city. Sarah was prone on the 4th floor of a bombed-out minaret. Her eye pressed against the high-powered optic of her Mk-13 sniper rifle. Her breathing was slow, measured, completely detached from the chaos brewing below. At 1,200 yards, the world is just math. Wind speed, barometric pressure, bullet drop, the rotation of the Earth. You don't think about the man in the crosshairs. You think about the physics. Raven 1, this is Overwatch. Talk to me. The voice crackled in her earpiece. It was Leo, her spotter, her best friend, the man who had pulled her out of a burning Humvee in Fallujah 3 years prior. He was positioned in an adjacent building with the rest of her SEAL element, 4 of the finest operators on the planet. Securing the extraction point. I have eyes on the main avenue. Leo, Sarah whispered, her voice barely louder than the desert wind. No movement. Where's the package? Convoy is delayed, Leo replied, the tension creeping into his voice. Something's wrong, Sarah. The streets are too quiet. Even the stray dogs are gone. He was right. The silence was heavy, pregnant with violence. Then, the world tore open. It didn't start with a gunshot. It started with the deafening roar of an RPG tearing through the reinforced concrete of Leo's building. A plume of black smoke and pulverized rock violently erupted into the sky. Leo, Sarah screamed, tracking her rifle toward his position. Through her scope, the nightmare unfolded. Dozens of enemy combatants were swarming from the subterranean tunnels beneath the city. They hadn't stumbled upon the SEAL team, they had been waiting for them. It was a perfectly executed ambush. Contact front, heavy armor. Leo's voice was frantic, accompanied by the relentless staccato of automatic gunfire. We are pinned down, taking heavy casualties. We need immediate exfil. Sarah's training took over. Panic is a luxury a sniper cannot afford. She exhaled, pausing her heartbeat. Crack. A militant aiming an RPG dropped instantly. She racked the bolt. Crack. A machine gunner on a technical truck slumped over the steering wheel. She fired again, and again, cycling the bolt with terrifying, mechanical precision. But there were too many. For every man she dropped, 3 more took his place. Command, this is Bravo Team, Leo yelled over the radio. We are compromised. Code Red. I say again, Code Red. We need air support and immediate extraction. Over. The radio hissed with static. Then, a voice came through. It wasn't the panicked voice of a dispatcher. It was calm, cultured, cold. It was Colonel Elias Thorne, the architect of Operation Red Dust. "Bravo team. This is command." Thorne's voice echoed in her ear. "Air support is currently unavailable. Nearest extraction asset is 80 miles out. You are ordered to hold position." Sarah froze. Hold position? They were surrounded by 100 heavily armed hostiles. Holding position meant dying. "Negative, command," Leo barked, coughing through the thick smoke. "We cannot hold. We will be overrun in less than 3 minutes. We need those Apaches now." "Thorne." There was a long, agonizing pause on the comms. When Thorne spoke again, his words struck Sarah harder than a physical bullet. "Bravo team. The Apaches have been rerouted to protect a high-value asset in the northern sector. Your objective is lost. You are officially designated as expendable. May God be with you. Command out." Expendable. The radio went dead. The silence on the frequency was the loudest sound Sarah had ever heard. They weren't coming. Thorne had sold them out. He had traded their lives to protect some political interest. Some backroom deal. "Leo," Sarah yelled into the comms. "Leo, fall back. Get to the tunnels. I'll cover you." "Can't move." "Sarah." Leo's voice was fading, wet with blood. "Legs gone. Miller is dead. Jackson is gone." A pause. A heavy, shuddering breath. "Get out of here. Raven, that's an order." "I am not leaving you," she screamed, abandoning her discipline, firing wildly into the advancing horde. "Tell my wife," Leo whispered. The radio clicked off. Through her optic, Sarah watched the door to Leo's compound shatter. She watched the militants flood into the room. She watched the flash of gunfire. And then, she watched her best friend die. She didn't run. She stayed in that minaret, pulling the trigger until her barrel was glowing hot, until the firing pin clicked on an empty chamber. She drew her sidearm, and when that was empty, she drew her combat knife. When they finally took her, it took 6 men to hold her down. What followed were 18 months of hell. 18 months in a black site prison beneath the desert. They beat her. They starved her. They tried to break her mind. But they didn't understand what they had captured. You cannot break something that is already shattered. You only leave jagged edges. She survived because of a singular, burning thought. A mantra she whispered in the dark when the pain became too much. Thorne. When the airstrike finally hit the prison compound a year and a half later, reducing the guards to ash, Sarah crawled out of the rubble like a demon rising from the underworld. She didn't contact the U.S. Embassy. She didn't call the Navy. She knew the moment she flagged her name, Thorne's men would finish the job the desert couldn't. Instead, she became a ghost. She crossed borders in the shadows, smuggled herself onto cargo ships, and bled her way across the ocean until her boots finally touched American soil. Another crack of thunder snapped Sarah back to reality. The Syrian heat vanished, replaced by the freezing Virginia rain. She stood over the empty grave. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a tarnished brass shell casing, the last round she had fired in Syria. She knelt down, the wet grass soaking through her jeans, and placed the casing gently on top of the marble headstone. "I'm sorry it took so long. Leo," she whispered, her voice rough like sandpaper. She stood up and pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat. It was a manifest she had stolen from a secure server in Berlin on her way home. It detailed the true nature of Operation Red Dust. It wasn't a counter-terrorism mission. It was a corporate cover-up. Thorne and 4 other high-ranking officials had sacrificed Bravo team to secure a billion-dollar pipeline contract. 5 names were printed on the list. 5 men who wore expensive suits, who shook hands in front of cameras, who slept peacefully in their lavish Washington D.C. mansions, believing their sins were buried under the Syrian sand. Sarah pulled a black Sharpie from her pocket. She drew a thick, dark line through the words Sarah E. Vance. She wasn't an American soldier anymore. The Navy SEAL who took an oath to protect and defend was dead and buried right here in Arlington. What stood in her place was something entirely different. A weapon stripped of its safety. A reckoning in a trench coat. Sarah turned her back on the grave and began to walk down the long, paved road toward the exit of the cemetery. The Capitol building loomed in the distance, a white dome against the stormy gray sky. She had a list, she had a rifle, and she had all the time in the world. The ghost of Arlington was coming home. The apartment smelled of stale cigarettes, peeling wallpaper, and Hoppy's No. 9 gun solvent. It was a dilapidated fifth-floor walk-up on the edge of Anacostia. The kind of building where the landlord only showed up to collect cash and the neighbors knew better than to ask questions. To anyone else, it was a slum. To Sarah, it was a fortress. More importantly, it had a rusted fire escape that offered an unobstructed, elevated view across the river into the glittering heart of the nation's capital. The room was pitch black, save for the amber glow of a single street lamp filtering through the grime-caked window. Sarah sat cross-legged on the bare hardwood floor. In front of her, laid out on a dark canvas mat, were the meticulously disassembled pieces of an M24 sniper weapon system. It wasn't standard military issue, it was a ghost gun, pieced together from black market parts smuggled out of Eastern Europe. But the action was smooth. The barrel was free-floating, and it was chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. It was a weapon designed to reach out and touch someone from a mile away. Her hands moved with a mechanical, practiced rhythm in the dark. Click, clack, slide. She didn't need to see the parts to assemble them. Her fingers knew the weapon intimately, reading the grooved metal like braille. She slid the bolt into the receiver, locking it in place with a satisfying, heavy metallic thud. She threaded a custom, foot-long titanium suppressor onto the heavy barrel. Finally, she mounted the Schmidt and Bender telescopic sight, tightening the rings with a torque wrench until they were perfectly seated. She picked up a single, brass-cased cartridge. The bullet was heavy, cold, and lethal. She rolled it between her thumb and forefinger before pressing it into the internal magazine. With the weapon assembled, Sarah reached for a manila folder resting beside her combat boots. She opened it, illuminating the contents with a small, red-lensed tactical flashlight. Inside was a weathered, 8x10 photograph. It had been taken 2 years ago at a private country club in Virginia. 5 men were in the frame, holding crystal glasses of scotch, smiling like they owned the world. And they did. They were the architects, politicians, intelligence directors, and defense contractors. They were the men who drew lines on maps and sent kids from Ohio and Texas to bleed over them. Sarah took a black marker and drew a circle around the man on the far left. Target 1. Richard Sterling. Sterling was the CEO of Apex Vanguard, a multi-billion-dollar private military contractor. He was the man who had funded the Syrian pipeline project. He was the man who had requested the land be cleared. He was the man who had paid Colonel Thorne to leave Bravo Team to die. Tonight, Sterling was hosting a lavish charity gala, a sickening irony, at a penthouse ballroom overlooking the Potomac. He would be surrounded by the D.C. elite, flanked by private security, completely insulated by his wealth and power. He thought he was untouchable. Sarah was about to teach him a lesson in ballistics. 11:45 p.m. 2 miles away. The night air was thick with the suffocating humidity that Washington, D.C. was famous for. Sarah was prone on the rooftop of a half-constructed commercial high-rise, 800 yards across the river from the penthouse ballroom. The city lights bled into the low-hanging clouds, casting an eerie, orange hue over the skyline. She was invisible, cloaked in a dark urban ghillie suit, wedged between 2 massive concrete HVAC units. Through the high-powered optic of her M24, the world shrank to a circular pane of glass. She dialed in the magnification, bringing the penthouse into sharp, terrifying focus. The ballroom was a wall of floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass. Inside, it was a sea of tuxedos and expensive evening gowns. Waiters carried silver trays of champagne. A jazz band played in the corner. It was a world of absolute luxury, entirely detached from the dirt and blood of the wars that funded it. Sarah swept her crosshairs through the crowd, methodical and cold. Security detail at the south entrance. 2 plainclothes guards by the bar. No roof access for the targets. Then, she found him. Richard Sterling. He was standing near the center of the glass wall, laughing heartily at a joke, a glass of dark liquor in his hand. He looked older than his picture, his silver hair catching the chandelier light, but the arrogant smirk was exactly the same. Sarah checked her Kestrel wind meter. Wind from the northwest. 7 miles per hour. Temperature, 72 degrees. Humidity, 80%. She adjusted the elevation and windage turrets on her scope with soft, distinct clicks. At 800 yards, the .300 Win Mag round would take roughly 1 full second to reach the target. In that second, the bullet would drop over 100 inches and be pushed sideways by the wind. She wasn't aiming at Sterling, she was aiming at an empty space of air above and to the left of his head. Trusting the physics of the universe to bring the bullet home. "You built an empire on my team's blood, Richard," Sarah whispered to the wind. She needed a mask for the sound. Even suppressed, a supersonic rifle round creates a miniature sonic boom, a sharp crack that would echo off the buildings. She glanced at her digital watch. 11:59 p.m. Sterling's gala was a midnight charity kickoff. The schedule she had intercepted promised a grand fireworks display over the river at exactly midnight. She settled back behind the scope. The crosshairs rested perfectly in the empty space beside Sterling's left shoulder. 10 seconds. She opened her mouth slightly to equalize the pressure in her ears. 5 seconds. She let out a slow, controlled breath, emptying her lungs entirely. Her body went completely still. Her heart rate dropped to 40 beats a minute. The space between the beats stretched out, infinite and quiet. 3, 2, 1. The first mortar shell of the fireworks display launched into the sky, exploding in a massive, thunderous canopy of red and gold over the Potomac. At the exact same fraction of a second, Sarah squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The suppressor swallowed the muzzle flash. But the supersonic crack of the bullet was instantly drowned out by the booming explosion of the fireworks. Through the scope, Sarah watched the physics play out. 1 second later, the reinforced glass window of the penthouse shattered inward like a spiderweb exploding. Richard Sterling's head snapped back violently. His Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the polished marble floor. Before the glass even settled, Sterling collapsed into a lifeless heap. His tuxedo instantly ruined. For 2 full seconds, the ballroom didn't react. The guests just stared, confused by the sudden draft, oblivious to the fact that the man they were just laughing with was dead. Then, the screaming started. Panic erupted. Security guards drew their weapons, looking wildly around the room. But there was nothing to shoot at. There was no smoke, no sound, no shooter, just a shattered window and a dead billionaire. Sarah didn't stay to watch the chaos. A good sniper never admires her work. She smoothly racked the bolt, catching the spent brass casing before it hit the concrete roof. It was burning hot against her palm, but she held onto it. She slipped it into her pocket, threw a dark tarp over her rifle, and melted into the shadows of the stairwell. By the time the first police sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the humid D.C. night, the rooftop was completely empty. The ghost of Arlington had fired her first shot, and the city was about to wake up to a nightmare. Crime scenes in Washington, D.C. usually smell like cheap liquor, desperation, and damp asphalt. The penthouse of the Apex Vanguard building, however, smelled like copper, spilled Macallan scotch, and fear. At 1:15 a.m., the ballroom was a circus of flashing red and blue lights. Uniformed officers from the Metropolitan Police Department had set up a perimeter, herding trembling billionaires and weeping socialites toward the elevators. Crime scene technicians in white Tyvek suits crawled over the Italian marble floor like meticulous ghosts. Detective Marcus Reed stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, a styrofoam cup of black coffee in his left hand. Reed was 52 years old, with salt and pepper hair cut close to the scalp, a wrinkled tan trench coat, and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world twice and weren't impressed either time. He leaned slightly on his right leg. A piece of shrapnel from an IED in Fallujah had permanently rearranged his knee 20 years ago, serving as a daily, aching reminder of his time in the Marine Corps. "All right, talk to me, Jenkins," Reed rasped, his voice deep and gravelly, seasoned by decades of cheap cigars. Officer Jenkins, a rookie who looked barely old enough to shave, swallowed hard. He kept his eyes averted from the tarp covering Richard Sterling's body. Victim is Richard Sterling, CEO of Apex Vanguard. Jenkins said, reading nervously from a small notepad. Time of death. Exactly midnight. Mid-sentence. Dozens of witnesses. Detective. But nobody saw a shooter. Nobody even heard the shot. The band was playing. The fireworks started going off outside. And then suddenly the window shattered and Sterling was on the floor. Reed didn't say a word. He limped slowly toward the massive, floor-to-ceiling window. It was thick, reinforced architectural glass. Or, at least, it had been. Now, it was a terrifying web of fractures radiating out from a single, perfectly punched hole roughly the size of a dime. Reed crouched down with a grunt, examining the entry point. Glass spalling on the interior. Reed muttered to himself, clean entry, high velocity, extremely high velocity. He stood up and walked over to the body. A technician pulled back the tarp. Reed didn't flinch at the gruesome sight. He studied the terminal ballistics. The entry wound was small, but the hydrostatic shock had been devastating. What kind of gangbanger sneaks a gun into a billionaire's gala? Jenkins asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Reed let out a dry, humorless chuckle. A gangbanger didn't do this. Kid. How do you know? Reed pointed his coffee cup at the dead man. Because there's no brass casing on the floor. There's no gunpowder residue in the air. And look at the angle of that entry wound. Reed stepped back and pulled a small pen laser from his coat pocket. He placed the back of the pen near Sterling's headrest and shined the red beam backward, tracing the trajectory of the bullet. The red dot passed exactly through the dime-sized hole in the shattered glass and painted a crimson speck on the thick clouds hanging over the dark Potomac River. The shooter wasn't in the room. Jenkins, Reed said quietly. Jenkins blinked, looking out the window into the pitch-black night. You're telling me someone shot him from outside? From the ground? Not the ground. The angle is descending, but barely. It was an elevated position. Reed squinted, staring into the darkness across the river. The rain had stopped, but the fog was rolling in thick. Over a mile away, the skeletal steel frame of an unfinished commercial high-rise loomed against the skyline. Reed pointed to the distant building. There. Jenkins let out a scoff of disbelief. Detective, with all due respect, that building is in Virginia. That's across the river. That's got to be 800, maybe 900 yards away. In the dark, with the wind coming off the water. No one can make that shot. Someone just did, Reed replied, his jaw tightening, and they timed it perfectly with the fireworks display to mask the supersonic crack of the rifle. The air in the room suddenly felt colder to Reed. He knew this kind of precision. He had lived with men who possessed it. It wasn't taught on the streets. And it certainly wasn't taught at the police academy. An hour later, Reed was standing on the concrete roof of the construction site across the river. The wind up here was vicious, biting through his trench coat. Two patrolmen stood by the stairwell, shivering and shining their flashlights over the scattered construction debris. Nothing up here, detective, one of the cops yelled over the wind. No weapon, no footprints, no shell casings. Place is a ghost town. Reed ignored them. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the concrete not for what was there, but for what was missing. He walked to the edge of the roof, the side facing the river. He knelt down behind two massive, gray HVAC units. It was a perfect blind, hidden from the street, shielded from the wind, with an unobstructed line of sight straight to the Apex Vanguard penthouse. Reed pulled out his own flashlight and shined it on the ground. He didn't find a brass casing. A professional would never leave a casing behind. It had fingerprints, extractor marks, a whole forensic fingerprint. But Reed found something else. In the thin layer of concrete dust and rainwater gathered near the ledge, there were two small, perfectly circular indentations. They were spaced about 8 inches apart. Behind them, a slight, almost imperceptible sweeping mark where someone's boots had rested. Bipod marks, Reed whispered. He reached out and touched the concrete. It was cold. Whoever had been here had lain perfectly still, probably for hours, waiting for the exact right fraction of a second to end a man's life. He closed his eyes, visualizing the shooter, right-handed, breathing slow, doping the wind, squeezing the trigger, catching the hot brass before it hit the ground, fading into the shadows before the glass even hit the floor. Detective? A voice broke his concentration. Reed opened his eyes. A plainclothes federal agent had just stepped onto the roof. He wore a sharp, tailored suit that cost more than Reed's car, and a badge clipped to his belt that read FBI. Special Agent Caldwell, the suit said, flashing a humorless smile. We'll take it from here. MPD. This is now a federal investigation. Reed stood up slowly, his bad knee popping in protest. He hated the feds on principle. But tonight, their sudden appearance told him everything he needed to know. You don't get a suited FBI agent on a rooftop at 3:30 in the morning for a random homicide. Fast response time. Caldwell. Reed noted dryly. Sterling's body isn't even cold yet. Sterling was a high-profile government contractor. National security implications. Caldwell replied smoothly, snapping his fingers at a team of agents who began swarming the roof. We suspect a foreign terror cell. Maybe domestic extremists. We'll handle the manhunt. Reed looked at Caldwell, then looked back at the bipod indentations in the dust. Foreign terror cell? Reed thought. Bullshit. Terrorists wanted a spectacle. They wanted bombs, manifestos, and screaming crowds. They didn't lie in the freezing rain for 6 hours to take a single, mathematically impossible shot at a billionaire and then vanish without taking credit. This wasn't terror. This was a surgical strike. You're looking in the wrong direction. Caldwell, Reed said, walking past the FBI agent toward the stairwell. Excuse me, detective? Caldwell snapped. Do you have a theory you'd like to share? Reed paused at the heavy metal door. He looked back at the city skyline, the Washington Monument glowing white in the distance. He felt a heavy, sinking feeling in his gut, a familiar, dark dread he hadn't felt since his days in the sandbox. That shot was 800 yards. Crosswind, at night, timed to a decibel drop. Reed said, his voice low and hard. You aren't looking for a gangbanger. Caldwell, and you aren't looking for a terrorist. Then who are we looking for? A ghost, Reed said. You're looking for a Tier 1 operator. SEAL, Force Recon, Delta. Whoever pulled that trigger is one of ours. And if they're hunting in D.C. Reed pulled his collar up against the wind. They're just getting started. Alexandria, Virginia, is a world away from the Syrian desert. Though it's only a 20-minute drive from the Pentagon, it is a place of manicured lawns, old oak trees, and the quiet, rhythmic thud of newspapers hitting front porches. At 6 p.m., the autumn sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the asphalt. Sarah sat in the driver's seat of a stolen, nondescript gray sedan parked halfway down Elm Street. She wore a faded olive-green jacket, her hair pulled back under a dark beanie. The engine was off. She hadn't moved a muscle in 45 minutes. Her eyes were fixed on a small, blue two-story house at the end of the cul-de-sac. There was a faded yellow ribbon tied around the oak tree in the front yard. On the porch, a child's tricycle lay on its side. Through the living room window, Sarah could see her, Maya. Maya was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring a glass of juice for a little boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. He had Leo's dark curly hair. He had Leo's smile. Maya looked exhausted. She was wearing an oversized gray navy midshipman hoodie, Leo's favorite shirt. A sharp, physical pain twisted in Sarah's chest. It was a phantom ache, worse than the bullet fragment still lodged in her left shoulder. Tell my wife? Leo's final, bleeding words echoed in her mind, drowning out the gentle hum of the suburban evening. Sarah looked down at the passenger seat. Resting on the worn fabric was a thick, padded manila envelope. Inside were 2 items. The first was a cashier's check for $500,000, drawn from an untraceable offshore shell company. It was a fraction of the blood money Richard Sterling had hidden away in a Swiss account, rerouted by Sarah before she put a bullet through his penthouse window. It would pay off Maya's mortgage. It would pay for the boys' college. The second item was infinitely more valuable. It was a simple, scratched gold wedding band. Sarah closed her eyes, the memory flashing behind her eyelids like a strobe light. She remembered the smoke, the deafening gunfire, the smell of burning cordite. She remembered crawling across the shattered concrete of the minaret, grabbing Leo's lifeless hand just seconds before the militants breached the door. She had violently yanked the ring from his finger. swallowing it dry to hide it from her captors. For 18 months in that pitch-black hole, she had kept it hidden. It was her anchor, the physical proof that Leo had existed, that he was loved, and that a debt was owed. Sarah opened her eyes. The streetlights flickered on. It was time. She slipped out of the car, moving with the terrifying, silent grace of a predator. She didn't walk on the pavement, she moved through the shadows of the hedges, her boots making absolutely no sound on the damp grass. She glided up the wooden steps of the Blue House. She placed the thick envelope gently on the welcome mat. For a single, agonizing second, Sarah pressed her gloved hand against the front door. She wanted to knock. She wanted to fall to her knees and beg Maya for forgiveness. She wanted to tell her how bravely Leo had fought. But a ghost cannot comfort the living. Her presence would only bring the darkness to Maya's doorstep. Sarah withdrew her hand. She turned to leave. And then, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't a sound. It was an absence of sound. The crickets had stopped chirping. The neighborhood dogs were dead quiet. Sarah's combat instincts, honed to a razor's edge, flooded her bloodstream with adrenaline. Her eyes scanned the street. 2 houses down, a black utility van that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago was idling by the curb. The headlights were off, but the engine was purring with a heavy, unnatural horsepower. Then, she saw the anomalies. A man in a dark windbreaker was walking a golden retriever down the opposite sidewalk. But he wasn't looking at the dog. He was looking at the Blue House. His right hand was resting stiffly near his waistband. He walked with the heavy, heel-to-toe tactical stride of a soldier, not a suburban dad. A second man was standing near the alleyway, a cell phone pressed to his ear. But his lips weren't moving, and a coiled acoustic earpiece ran down the back of his neck. They aren't cops, Sarah realized instantly. MPD didn't move like this. The FBI didn't move like this. These were operators, private military, cleaners. They weren't here investigating Richard Sterling's murder. The timeline was too fast. No, they were here because Colonel Elias Thorne had finally realized his nightmare had come true. He knew his ghost had crawled out of the grave, and he had sent his hounds to watch the only vulnerability she had left, Leo's family. Target acquired. Front porch. The man by the alleyway whispered into his lapel microphone. They saw her. Sarah didn't panic. She didn't run wildly into the street. She melted. In a fraction of a second, she dropped off the edge of the porch, disappearing into the thick azalea bushes. She's moving. Flank her. A voice barked over a hidden radio frequency. Sarah drew a sleek, blackened karambit knife from her tactical belt. The curved, lethal blade locked into her grip. She couldn't use a gun. A gunshot would bring the police. It would terrify Maya, and it would turn this quiet street into a war zone. This had to be intimate. This had to be silent. She crept through the side yard, pressing her back against the wooden fence. The man who had been walking the dog released the leash. He drew a suppressed Glock 19, sweeping the muzzle through the shadows. He stepped into the side yard, moving slowly, his eyes darting behind his tactical glasses. He made a fatal mistake. He looked at the ground for footprints. Sarah dropped from the low-hanging branch of the oak tree directly behind him. Before he could even register the shift in the air, Sarah's left arm clamped over his mouth and nose, cutting off his airway and his scream. Her right hand moved in a brutal, economic arc. The karambit severed the tendons in his gun arm, rendering the weapon useless before it hit the grass. She dragged him backward into the deep shadows of the fence line, choking him out with terrifying efficiency. He thrashed, kicking his legs, but Sarah's grip was like a steel vise. In 8 seconds, his eyes rolled back, and he went entirely limp. She didn't kill him. Dead men can't deliver messages. She laid him gently on the ground and quickly rifled through his pockets. She found a burner phone and a folded piece of paper. Sarah opened the paper in the dim moonlight. It was a satellite photo of her. It had been taken hours ago, showing her walking out of Arlington National Cemetery. Stamped across the top in red ink was a single word: exterminate. They didn't just know she was alive. They were hunting her. Sarah heard the crunch of gravel. The second cleaner was entering the alleyway, his suppressed weapon raised, searching for his missing partner. Sarah looked at the burner phone in her hand. She pressed the dial button on the last dialed number. It rang once. Status? A cold? Familiar voice answered. Sarah's blood turned to ice. It was Colonel Elias Thorne. He was managing the hit team personally. Sarah raised the phone to her lips. She looked back at the Blue House, where Maya had just found the envelope on the porch and was covering her mouth in shock. The status, Sarah whispered into the phone, her voice dropping to a gravelly, demonic register, is that you left me in the dark too long, Elias, and now, I can see perfectly. She crushed the burner phone in her hand, tossing the broken plastic onto the chest of the unconscious mercenary. The hunt was officially a two-way street. Sarah vaulted over the wooden fence and disappeared into the sprawling D.C. night, leaving the cleaners to find their broken man, and leaving the widow with a paid debt. The ghost was gone, but the war had just arrived on Thorne's doorstep. Underneath the marble monuments and the glowing dome of the Capitol, Washington, D.C., is built on a labyrinth. Hundreds of miles of concrete tunnels, maintenance shafts, and subway tracks snake beneath the city like hardened arteries. Down here, there is no sunlight, there is only the smell of ozone, damp concrete, and the metallic screech of steel wheels. It was 9 p.m. the following night. Senator Thomas Hayes, target number 2 on Sarah's list, was standing at a podium erected on the platform of the Judiciary Square metro station. The station had been temporarily closed to the public for a live, televised town hall. Hayes was a man who made his living selling fear. He was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and the primary political architect behind Operation Red Dust. He had rubber-stamped the deployment of Bravo Team into a meat grinder, all to secure the land for Richard Sterling's pipeline. Now, he was on live television, using Sterling's assassination to demand billions in new domestic security funding. The hypocrisy made Sarah's blood run cold. She wasn't on a rooftop tonight. She was 60 feet underground, crawling through a ventilation duct suspended directly above the station platform. The air inside the galvanized steel shaft was thick with dust and heat. Through the metal grating beneath her, she could see the bright, artificial glare of the TV studio lights. She could see Hayes sweating under the makeup, surrounded by a dozen Capitol police officers and a sea of reporters. But she also saw something else. Positioned at the escalators, blending in with the political aides, were 4 men wearing tailored suits with coiled earpieces. They weren't Capitol Police. They were Thorne's cleaners. They had deduced her list. They knew Hayes was next. And they were using the senator as bait to trap the ghost. Sarah pulled a customized, integrally suppressed Sig Sauer MPX submachine gun from her back. It was compact, lethal, and virtually silent. She checked her watch. The live broadcast was hitting its peak viewership. We cannot let the tragic loss of Richard Sterling intimidate us, Senator Hayes boomed into the microphone, his voice echoing off the vaulted, waffle-patterned ceiling of the metro station. This city will not bow to terrorists. Sarah rested the barrel of the MPX against the metal grate. She didn't need a scope for this. She needed a distraction. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a small, spherical EMP, electromagnetic pulse, grenade, a toy she had liberated from a black site armory in Berlin. She twisted the timer to 3 seconds. She dropped it through the grate. The small sphere fell silently through the air, landing perfectly inside a massive, heavy-duty lighting rig to the left of the stage. 3, 2, 1. A brilliant, blinding flash of blue-white light erupted from the rig. In an instant, every television camera, every microphone, and every overhead station light blew out with a synchronized, deafening pop. The station plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. Panic exploded. Reporters screamed. Capitol Police drew their weapons blindly. But Sarah had already flipped down her panoramic night vision goggles. The darkness transformed into a crisp, glowing green landscape. While the world was blind, she found Hayes in the chaos. He was frozen behind the podium, his mouth hanging open in terror. Sarah aimed through the grate. Peefed. 2 suppressed subsonic rounds took Senator Hayes perfectly in the chest. He collapsed backward, pulling the podium down with him in a crash of splintered wood. Target number 2 was down, And millions of Americans had just watched their screens cut to static at the exact moment of his death. But Sarah didn't have time to savor it. The four cleaners had immediately thrown on their own night vision optics. They didn't look at the dead senator, they looked straight up at the ceiling. A hail of suppressed gunfire tore through the metal ventilation shaft. Bullets punched through the galvanized steel inches from Sarah's face, showering her in jagged shrapnel and sparks. She kicked out the grate ahead of her and dropped 15 feet onto the roof of a stationary, out-of-service metro train parked on the opposite track. She rolled to absorb the impact, immediately sliding off the curved roof and dropping onto the tracks below. "Target is in the tunnels. Southbound tracks. Move, move, move," one of the cleaners yelled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Sarah sprinted into the cavernous, swallowing darkness of the tunnel. This was her element. The SEALs don't just teach you how to shoot, they teach you how to turn the environment into a weapon. They teach you how to be the monster in the dark. The tunnel was barely wide enough for 2 tracks. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of rust and rat droppings. To her left was the third rail, carrying 750 volts of raw, unadulterated direct current. Behind her, the 4 cleaners dropped onto the tracks, their tactical flashlights cutting through the gloom, their laser sights dancing wildly against the curved walls. "Spread out. Keep your fields of fire overlapping," the lead cleaner barked. Sarah stopped running. She ducked into a small, recessed maintenance alcove carved into the tunnel wall. She took a slow, deep breath, forcing her heart rate down. She could hear their heavy, tactical boots crunching on the gravel. They were moving fast, confident in their numbers. She unclipped a heavy steel carabiner from her belt and tied it to a length of paracord. As the first 2 cleaners passed her alcove, sweeping their rifles forward, Sarah stepped out from the shadows directly behind them. She swung the steel carabiner like a pendulum, tossing it perfectly across the tracks. The heavy metal hit the electrified third rail, instantly bridging the gap to the grounded running rail. The result was a catastrophic electrical arc flash. A localized explosion of blinding, white-hot plasma erupted in the tunnel with the sound of a thunderclap. The sudden, intense flash of ultraviolet light overloaded the cleaners' night vision goggles, instantly blinding them and burning their retinas. They screamed, ripping the goggles off their faces, firing blindly into the dark. Sarah was already moving. She lunged at the closest blinded man, driving her knee into the side of his leg, snapping his knee joint with a sickening crunch. As he fell, she grabbed the barrel of his rifle, pivoting his body to absorb the wild gunfire of his panicked partner. 2 down. The remaining 2 cleaners at the rear fell back, terrified by the sudden violence. They realized they weren't hunting a terrified woman, they had walked into a meat grinder. "She's in the walls. Fall back," one screamed. A low, rumbling vibration began to shake the concrete beneath Sarah's boots. The gravel on the tracks started to dance. A pinpoint of light appeared far down the tunnel. An active, northbound train was coming, fast. The 2 surviving cleaners saw the light and turned to run back toward the station platform. But Sarah wasn't going to let them carry her ghost story back to Thorne. She raised the MPX to her shoulder. Ignoring the trembling of the earth beneath her, she led her target, calculated the movement, and squeezed the trigger. Peefed, peefed. The cleaner in the rear dropped instantly, sliding face first across the wooden railroad ties. The final cleaner reached the edge of the station platform, scrambling desperately to pull himself up to safety. The train was blaring its horn now, a deafening roar filling the claustrophobic space, its massive headlights turning the tunnel as bright as day. Sarah stood her ground on the adjacent track, the wind from the approaching train whipping her coat violently around her legs. She fired one last time. The round struck the final cleaner's hand just as he gripped the ledge of the platform. He screamed, his grip failing, and he tumbled backward onto the tracks. A second later, the northbound train roared past Sarah at 50 miles an hour, a massive wall of steel and screeching brakes. When the dust finally settled and the red taillights of the train faded into the darkness, the tunnel was dead quiet again. Sarah picked up her empty brass casings, methodically erasing her footprint from the battlefield. She slipped into a rusted maintenance door leading to the city's sewer system, disappearing completely beneath the streets. 10:30 p.m. Above ground. The city was in total lockdown. Sirens wailed from every quadrant of the capital. Military helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting frantically through the fog. The assassination of a sitting U.S. senator on live television had sent Washington into DEFCON1. Detective Marcus Reed stood on the Judiciary Square platform, staring down at the blood on the tracks. He was reviewing the security footage on a tablet handed to him by a pale-faced Capitol Police captain. The video was chaotic, but right before the lights blew out, the camera caught a split-second reflection in the glass of the station manager's booth. It was a blurry, distorted image of a woman's face staring down from the ventilation shaft. Reed paused the video and zoomed in. He recognized the cold, dead, thousand-yard stare. He had seen it in the mirror every morning for 20 years. "Mother of God," Reed whispered. "Do we have an ID on the terror cell?" "Detective?" the captain asked nervously. Reed handed the tablet back. "It's not a cell. It's one person, and she's not a terrorist." Reed turned and looked toward the pitch-black mouth of the tunnel. He finally understood what was happening. It wasn't random violence. It was a surgical, systematic dismantling of the people in power. "Get me the files on every classified military operation in the Middle East for the last 5 years." Reed ordered, his voice tight. "Whoever she is, she was left for dead. And now, she's bringing the war home." Pain is a metronome. It ticks in the background of your mind, keeping perfect, excruciating time with every beat of your heart. For Sarah Vance, the ticking was deafening. It was 2 a.m. She was 3 miles away from the Judiciary Square metro station, barricaded inside a forgotten, subterranean pump room beneath the D.C. water treatment plant. The air tasted of copper and mold. The only light came from a single, caged bulb hanging from a rusted pipe, casting harsh, yellow shadows against the damp concrete walls. She hadn't escaped the tunnel completely untouched. During the chaos of the approaching train and the final gunfight, a ricochet, a jagged piece of a 5.56 mm copper jacket, had sparked off a steel pillar and torn through the left side of her abdomen. It hadn't hit any major organs, but it had sliced deep into the muscle. She was losing blood, and in the adrenaline dump of the escape, she hadn't realized how much. Sarah stripped off her heavy, soaked tactical coat, letting it drop to the floor with a wet thud. She gritted her teeth, her breath coming in ragged, hissing gasps. Her black undershirt was slick and heavy with dark, arterial blood. She dragged a heavy wooden crate to the center of the room and set up her workspace. There are no hospitals for ghosts. If you want to survive, you become your own surgeon. She laid out her supplies from a small waterproof medkit, a bottle of high-proof rubbing alcohol, a pair of forceps, a curved suturing needle, heavy black nylon thread, and a clean rag. Sarah sat on a metal stool and looked down at the wound. It was an ugly, ragged tear just above her hip bone. The edges were inflamed, leaking crimson down her side. "All right," she whispered to the empty room. "Breathe through it, just physics." She uncapped the rubbing alcohol. She didn't hesitate. She poured the clear liquid directly into the open wound. The pain was absolute. It was a blinding, white-hot spike that shot up her spine and exploded behind her eyes. Sarah clamped her jaw down on the leather strap of her belt, swallowing a gut-wrenching scream. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of the wooden crate, her entire body trembling violently. She waited for the wave of agony to recede, panting heavily, sweat pouring down her face and stinging her eyes. She picked up the forceps. She had to fish the shrapnel out before she could close the skin, or the heavy metal poisoning and infection would kill her by Friday. She probed the bloody trench of the wound, feeling the cold steel of the tweezers scrape against her own ribcage. Clink. She found it. With a sharp twist of her wrist, she yanked the jagged piece of copper out and dropped it onto the concrete floor. It sounded like a dropped coin. Next came the needle. She threaded the black nylon, her hands surprisingly steady despite the trauma. She pierced her own skin, pulling the thread tight, tying off the knot. 1 stitch, 2, 3, 4. By the fifth stitch, the blood loss and the shock began to take their toll. The cold, damp walls of the pump room started to waver. The yellow light of the bulbs stretched and distorted. The sound of water dripping from a nearby pipe morphed into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. The temperature in the room plummeted. Sarah shivered, pulling the thread on the sixth stitch. But she couldn't feel her fingers anymore. "You're pulling it too tight. Raven, going to scar." Sarah froze. The leather belt slipped from her mouth. She looked up. Sitting on a rusted generator in the corner of the room was Jackson, her team's heavy weapons specialist. He was wearing his desert camis, entirely untouched by the dirt or the blood of Syria. He was casually cleaning his aviator sunglasses. "Jackson," Sarah breathed, her voice cracking. "Hey, boss." Jackson smiled, a sad, familiar grin. "You look like hell." You're dead. I watched you die." "Yeah, well, details." Another voice chimed in. Sarah slowly turned her head. Leaning against the metal door, arms crossed, was Miller, their communications expert. He looked perfectly healthy, despite the massive crater in his chest plate that Sarah knew was there beneath his rig. And then, stepping out of the shadows, was Leo. He didn't look like the broken, bleeding man she had left in the minaret. He looked like the man who had laughed with her at the bar in Virginia. The man who had bought the first round after they earned their trident pins. "Leo," Sarah choked out, a single tear cutting a clean line down her blood and sweat-streaked face. Leo walked over and knelt beside her. He didn't touch her, ghosts can't touch the living, but she felt the warmth of his presence. "You went to see Maya," Leo said softly. His eyes were kind, devoid of judgment. "You left the ring. You didn't have to do that." "Sarah, the debt was already paid." "No." Sarah shook her head violently, the delirium blurring the lines between the past and the present. "I left you. I should have stayed. I should have died in that room with you." "If you died, who was going to balance the ledger?" Leo asked, his voice echoing slightly, as if coming from down a long tunnel. "But you need to see clearly. Raven, you think Thorne sold us out just for a pipeline? Just for money?" Sarah blinked, the needle hanging forgotten from her side. "The manifest. Apex Vanguard paid him." "Look deeper," Miller interrupted from the door. "Think back to 2 weeks before the drop. Sarah, think about the armory in Ramadi." The fever spiked, the room spun, and suddenly, Sarah wasn't in D.C. anymore. She was in a sterile, air-conditioned command tent in Iraq. 2 weeks before Operation Red Dust. Sarah stood at attention in front of Colonel Elias Thorne's desk. The air was thick with tension. She had placed a manila folder on his desk, a logistical report she had compiled off the books. "What is this, Chief Vance?" Thorne had asked, his voice smooth, completely devoid of emotion. He didn't look at the folder, he looked right through her. "It's a discrepancy report, sir," Sarah had said, her posture rigid. 3 shipments of M4 carbines and AT-4 anti-tank rockets never reached the Kurdish allies. "I tracked the transport manifests. The serial numbers match the weapons being used by the insurgent forces in the northern sector. Someone in this camp is supplying the enemy. Colonel." Thorne had finally picked up the folder. He didn't open it, he simply slid it into a paper shredder beside his desk. The machine whined, reducing her evidence to confetti. "War is a complex ecosystem, Chief," Thorne had said coldly. "Sometimes, to maintain balance, weapons must flow to unexpected places. It is a matter of grand strategy. Above your pay grade." "Sir, with respect, that is treason." Thorne's eyes had narrowed. A terrifying, dead silence had filled the tent. "You are a very talented sniper, Vance," Thorne whispered softly, "but you have a dangerous habit of looking at things that don't concern you." "Dismissed." Sarah gasped, snapping back to the dim, yellow light of the D.C. pump room. The ghosts were gone. She was entirely alone. But the truth remained, heavy and suffocating. Thorne hadn't just abandoned Bravo team as collateral damage. The pipeline was just a convenient excuse. The ambush had been a targeted assassination. Thorne had deliberately sent her team into that city. He had provided the insurgents with the missing weapons and given them Bravo team's exact coordinates. He had done it to silence her. Leo, Miller, Jackson, They had all died just because they had the misfortune of being on her squad. She was the target all along. The shock of the revelation hit her harder than the bullet in her side. The guilt threatened to crush her chest. They died because of me. But as the seconds ticked by, the crushing weight of the guilt began to change. It crystallized. It hardened under the intense, burning heat of the betrayal. The sorrow evaporated, leaving behind something infinitely more dangerous. Pure, unadulterated rage. Sarah picked up the needle and finished the last 3 stitches without flinching. She bit down on the thread, severing it with her teeth. She wrapped a tight pressure bandage around her waist, binding the wound tightly. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, and the fever still burned in her veins. But her mind had never been clearer. She walked over to a rusted, broken mirror hanging above a utility sink. She looked at her reflection. She was pale, covered in grime and dried blood, her eyes dark and hollow. She didn't look like a Navy SEAL anymore. She looked like a nightmare. And that was exactly what she needed to be. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the weathered photograph of the 5 men. She took a black marker and drew a thick circle around Senator Thomas Hayes. 2 down, 3 to go. She looked at the man in the center of the photo. Colonel Elias Thorne. He was smiling, his uniform adorned with medals he hadn't earned, bought with the blood of better men. You wanted a ghost, Elias, Sarah whispered to the broken mirror. You're about to find out what haunts the dark. She grabbed her rifle, checked the action, and stepped out of the pump room, melting back into the shadows of the city. The hunt was entering its final phase. By 4 a.m., the torrential rain had returned to Washington, D.C., washing the blood from the subway tracks and turning the city streets into slick, black mirrors. The National Mall was entirely deserted. The monuments loomed in the fog like pale giants, indifferent to the chaos unfolding in their shadows. Detective Marcus Reed walked with a heavy, agonizing limp down the paved pathway of Constitution Gardens. His trench coat was soaked through. His bad knee was screaming, the damp cold biting deep into the old shrapnel wound. But he didn't stop. He was heading for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The wall. Reed knew how operators thought. When a Tier 1 asset is wounded, hunted, and running on fumes, they don't go to hotels. They don't go to hospitals. They seek out ground they understand. They seek out their own kind. As Reed descended the gentle slope into the earth, the massive, V-shaped wall of polished black gabbro rose up beside him. More than 58,000 names were carved into the stone. In the dark, wet granite, Reed could see his own tired reflection perfectly mirrored against the names of the dead. He stopped near the center of the memorial, right where the wall was highest. The only sound was the rain hissing against the stone. I know you're here, Reed called out, his voice hoarse, echoing softly in the sunken trench. The shadows beneath the weeping willow trees remained completely still. I ran your service record, Chief Petty Officer Vance, Reed continued, not reaching for his weapon, keeping his hands empty at his sides. 3 tours, Silver Star, Navy Cross. The psych evals said you were fiercely loyal. They also said you had a problem with authority when it compromised the mission. Silence. My name is Marcus Reed. Homicide. I did a tour in Fallujah with the 1st Marine Division, Reed said, playing his only card. I know what it smells like when a Humvee burns. I know what it feels like to leave pieces of yourself in the sand. From the absolute darkness behind him, a voice materialized. It was raspy, strained with pain, and colder than the November rain. If you know what it smells like, Marine, then you know you should turn around and walk away. Reed froze. He hadn't heard a footstep. He hadn't heard the rustle of a coat. But he could feel the ghost standing less than 10 feet behind him. He could feel the crosshairs fixed squarely on the back of his neck. Slowly, carefully, Reed turned around. Sarah was stepping out from the cover of a massive oak tree. She was a silhouette in the fog, her dark trench coat blending seamlessly with the night. In her hands, an integrally suppressed submachine gun hung from a tactical sling. The muzzle pointed directly at his chest. Even in the dim light, Reed could see she was hurt. She held her posture slightly favored to the right, protecting her left side. You're bleeding, Chief, Reed said quietly. It's just physics. Detective. Bodies leak when you put holes in them, Sarah replied, her eyes locked on his. Dead and unblinking. You need a hospital. I need 3 more names, Sarah countered, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. You're standing between me and the men who sold my team to a firing squad. I don't want to kill a cop. Especially not a Marine. Don't make me add collateral damage to my ledger. Reed stood his ground, though every instinct told him to dive for cover. The ledger is already overflowing. Sarah, the FBI, Homeland Security, the CIA, they're tearing D.C. apart looking for you. They have shoot-to-kill orders. It ends tonight. One way or another. It ends. It ends when Elias Thorne looks me in the eye and pays his tab. She whispered, the raw emotion finally cracking through her icy exterior. Thorne is a monster. I know it. I read the classified files. I know about Operation Red Dust. Reed pleaded, stepping closer, closing the distance. But if you execute him, if you keep butchering politicians in the street, you're not a soldier anymore. Sarah, you're just a serial killer. You become the exact thing Thorne said you were, a rogue acid. A terrorist. Sarah's grip tightened on her weapon. A muscle feathered in her jaw. The rain ran down the brim of her black baseball cap, hiding the tears she refused to shed. They buried an empty box in Arlington, Sarah said, her voice shaking with a terrifying, contained fury. They played taps. They folded a flag. And while they were playing dress up, my spotter was bleeding out on a concrete floor because Thorne gave his coordinates to the highest bidder. She pointed the barrel of the MPX straight at Reed's heart. You talk to me about the law, detective? The law protects the men in the penthouses. It doesn't protect the grunts in the dirt. Justice isn't a courtroom. Justice is a debt that must be paid in full. Reed looked down the barrel of the gun. He had looked death in the face before, but he had never seen it look so profoundly heartbroken. He slowly reached into his trench coat. Sarah's finger tensed on the trigger. Hands where I can see them. Marcus. Relax, Chief, Reed said, pulling his hand out slowly. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. He tossed them onto the wet grass between them. They landed with a metallic clink. I'm not going to draw on you, Sarah, and I'm not going to fight you, Reed said, his voice steady. I'm giving you a choice. You can pick those up, put them on, and we can take Thorne down in the daylight. We can expose the pipeline. We can expose the treason. Let the world see him for what he is. Sarah looked at the handcuffs. Then, she looked up at the black granite wall beside them, at the thousands of names of soldiers who had died following orders from men in air-conditioned rooms. Thorne owns the daylight, Marcus, Sarah said softly. I own the dark. She didn't shoot. She lowered her weapon. Sarah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted titanium flash drive. It held the unredacted manifest, the Swiss bank account transfers, and the audio files of Thorne's backdoor deals. She tossed it through the rain. Reed caught it instinctively. What is this? He asked. That's the truth, Sarah said, stepping backward, her form beginning to melt back into the thick, rolling fog. When the dust settles, be a good cop. Marcus, clean up the mess. Sarah, wait, Reed yelled, taking a step forward. But it was too late. A heavy gust of wind swept off the reflecting pool, driving a sheet of rain across the memorial. By the time Reed wiped the water from his eyes, the pathway was entirely empty. There were no footprints. There was no sound. The ghost had vanished, leaving Detective Reed alone with the names of the dead, a flash drive full of treason, and the terrifying realization that Sarah Vance wasn't going to stop until D.C. burned to the ground. Reed looked down at the flash drive in his hand. He slipped it into his pocket, left the handcuffs in the wet grass, and turned to walk back into the city. The hunters were about to become the hunted. 40 miles outside the Washington Beltway, nestled deep in the dense, forested hills of Great Falls, Virginia, stood the Blackwood Estate. It was a sprawling, 20-acre property that belonged on the cover of an architectural magazine. But tonight, it was operating as a fortress. 10-foot-high wrought iron gates were reinforced with steel plates. The perimeter was lined with motion sensors, thermal cameras, and a private army of 50 Apex Vanguard mercenaries armed with military-grade assault rifles. Inside the mahogany-paneled library of the main house, the remaining 3 men on Sarah's list were unraveling. Director William Croft of the CIA's clandestine services paced the floor, chewing on an unlit cigar, his silk tie undone. Beside him, sinking into a leather armchair with a glass of gin, was General Arthur Montgomery, a 4-star Pentagon bureaucrat who had signed the fake intelligence reports that sent Bravo team to Syria. And standing by the roaring fireplace, looking out the reinforced glass window into the rainy darkness, was Colonel Elias Thorne. She assassinated a sitting U.S. senator on live television, Croft hissed, his voice trembling. She took out Sterling from 800 yards. And your cleaners are lying in a morgue. We need to call in the National Guard. Elias. If we call the Guard, we open an official inquiry. Thorne replied coldly, not turning away from the window. An inquiry leads to the pipeline. It leads to the weapons we moved through Ramadi. We handle this in-house. She is one woman, wounded and exhausted. She cannot breach this perimeter. She's a Tier 1 operator. Montgomery barked, slamming his glass down. We trained her to be a ghost. And now you think a wrought iron fence is going to stop her? Thorne finally turned, his eyes hard and empty. Let her come. She wants me. And when she steps out of the trees, my men will cut her to ribbons. 11:45 p.m. The tree line. Thorne was right about one thing. Sarah Vance was in the trees. She lay prone on a ridge overlooking the estate, 1,000 yards from the main house. The rain beat down relentlessly against her dark ghillie suit, turning her into just another mound of wet moss and dead leaves. Her left side burned with a sickening, localized heat where the stitches held her flesh together. But her mind was ice cold. She looked through the Schmidt & Bender optic of her customized M24 sniper rifle. She didn't sweep the windows looking for Thorne. She swept the perimeter looking for the weaknesses. Overlapping patrols, dogs on the east gate, heavy machine gun nest on the roof. It was an impressive defense. A frontal assault would be suicide. But snipers don't do frontal assaults. They dismantle the enemy's foundation until the house collapses on its own. Sarah reached into her tactical rig and pulled out a specialized radio scanner. She dialed through the encrypted frequencies until she found the heavy, rhythmic chatter of the Apex Vanguard security detail. She plugged a small black cable from the scanner into her modified satellite phone. Then, she pressed play. Inside the earpieces of all 50 mercenaries patrolling the estate, the tactical chatter was suddenly drowned out by a deafening blast of static. And then, a voice echoed in their ears. It was a recording, distorted but painfully clear. Contact front, heavy armor. We are pinned down, taking heavy casualties. We need immediate exfil. It was the archived radio transmission of Leo's final moments in Syria. Down in the compound, the mercenaries stopped dead in their tracks. Confusion rippled through the ranks. Command, what is this traffic? Someone is bleeding on the comms. A squad leader yelled into his mic. But Sarah had jammed their outgoing signals. All they could hear was the ghosts of Operation Red Dust. I say again, Code Red, we need air support. Tell my wife. The psychological warfare had begun. While the guards were distracted by the haunting voices in their ears, Sarah shifted her crosshairs. She wasn't aiming at a man. She was aiming at the massive, steel-caged industrial power transformer sitting just outside the western wall of the estate. She chambered a specialized, armor-piercing incendiary round. She exhaled. She squeezed the trigger. Crack! The rifle roared. A second later, the heavy transformer exploded in a blinding shower of blue and orange sparks. A localized shockwave rattled the trees. Instantly, the entire Blackwood estate plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Lights out! Lights out! Use your night vision! The mercenary squad leader screamed over the compound, panic finally bleeding into his professional demeanor. 30 seconds later, the deep, mechanical rumble of the estate's backup diesel generators kicked in. The emergency red floodlights hummed to life, casting the courtyard in a bloody, sinister glow. But Sarah had already planned for the backups. She racked the bolt, chambering a standard .300 Win Mag round. She adjusted her elevation 2 mils down. Crack! The main fuel line of the diesel generator ruptured. Crack. The engine block shattered. The red emergency lights flickered, died, and plunged the estate back into the pitch black. This time, the lights weren't coming back on. Inside the library, total panic had taken over. Director Croft scrambled in the dark, his hands frantically feeling the walls. "She's here. The bitch is here," Croft screamed. "I'm not dying in this house. Elias, I'm making a run for the armored SUV." "Croft, stay away from the doors," Thorne yelled, drawing a custom 1911 pistol. But Croft wasn't listening. The fear had completely consumed his logic. He burst through the library's French doors, sprinting out onto the sprawling, unlit stone patio toward the driveway. "Cover me. I'm the director of the CIA. I order you to cover me," he shrieked at the confused mercenaries in the yard. A mile away, in the driving rain, Sarah's night vision optic painted the world in crisp, glowing green. She watched Croft sprint across the patio. His thermal signature glowed bright white, a beacon of terror in the dark. Sarah's breathing was slow, deep, perfectly rhythmic. She tracked his movement, calculating his speed, the angle of his descent down the stairs, and the heavy crosswind. "Lead the target." She squeezed the trigger. The suppressed muzzle flash was swallowed by the rain. A mile away, Director William Croft was halfway to the armored SUV when the .300 Winchester Magnum round struck him center mass. The kinetic energy lifted him entirely off his feet, throwing him backward onto the wet cobblestones. He didn't scream. He didn't move again. Target number 3 was erased. General Montgomery watched from the shattered library doors. His military discipline broke. "Suppressing fire. Light up the tree line," Montgomery roared at the mercenaries. 50 assault rifles opened fire at once. The night erupted in a deafening, chaotic symphony of muzzle flashes and tearing bark. Thousands of rounds shredded the forest canopy. But they were shooting blind. They were shooting at a ghost. Sarah didn't return fire. She simply rolled backward off the ridge, sliding down the muddy embankment, abandoning her heavy M24 sniper rifle in the dirt. It had served its purpose. It had locked them in the dark and broken their minds. Now, she needed speed. She drew her suppressed Sig Sauer MPX submachine gun and pulled her blackened karambit knife. She moved fluidly through the deep brush, flanking the estate, moving toward the blind spot she had identified on the northern wall. Down in the courtyard, General Montgomery realized the gunfire was doing nothing but wasting ammunition. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Montgomery yelled, stepping cautiously onto the patio. Before the echo of his order even faded, a shadow dropped silently from the stone overhang above the patio. Sarah landed crouched directly behind General Montgomery. Before he could turn, she hooked her arm around his neck, dragging him violently backward into the deep shadows of the library. 3 mercenaries turned just in time to see the general swallowed by the darkness. Inside the blacked-out room, Montgomery thrashed, reaching for his sidearm. Sarah drove her knee into his spine, pinned his arm, and pressed the cold, suppressed barrel of the MPX under his jaw. Peeved, target number 4 slumped to the floor, his metals clinking against the hardwood. Sarah stepped over his body, her eyes adjusting to the absolute dark of the house. Her breathing was ragged, her left side screaming in agony. But the ledger was almost balanced. She looked across the room. The door to the estate's subterranean bunker was standing wide open. Thorne's private guard was dead on the floor. Elias Thorne had abandoned his men, abandoned his co-conspirators, and locked himself in the vault below. Sarah reached down and pulled a fresh 30-round magazine from her vest. She slammed it into her weapon with a sharp, metallic click. The outside world, the mercenaries, the rain, the police sirens wailing in the far distance, faded away entirely. There was only one name left on the list. She stepped over the threshold and began her descent into the earth. The air in the subterranean bunker tasted like recycled ozone and stale copper. Sarah descended the spiraling, reinforced concrete stairwell. With every step, a fresh wave of agony radiated from the gunshot wound in her side. Her pressure bandage was soaked through, the dark blood dripping steadily onto the gray steel grate beneath her boots. She had roughly 20 minutes before the blood loss dropped her blood pressure to a fatal level. But 20 minutes was all she needed. At the bottom of the stairwell was a heavy, bank vault-style blast door. Standing in front of it were Thorne's final two Praetorians. They weren't standard mercenaries, they were heavily armored. Private military contractors wearing ballistic face masks and holding compact PDWs, personal defense weapons. They had their weapons trained on the stairwell, waiting for her to step into the light. Sarah stopped 2 flights up. Hidden in the shadows of the landing, she leaned against the cold concrete wall, her breathing shallow and ragged. She unclipped the last piece of ordnance on her tactical vest, a customized 9-bang flash crash grenade. She pulled the pin. She didn't throw it, she simply let it roll off the edge of the stairs. It bounced down the metal grates. Clink, clink, clink. The 2 guards looked up. A blinding, stroboscopic sequence of 9 concussive explosions detonated in the enclosed stairwell. The noise was apocalyptic, shattering the fluorescent light tubes and turning the bottom floor into a deafening, white-hot blender of sound and light. Before the final bang even echoed, Sarah vaulted over the railing, dropping 15 feet straight down into the smoke. She landed hard, her bad side screaming, but her MPX submachine gun was already up. The guards were completely disoriented, firing blindly into the walls. Their eardrums ruptured. Sarah didn't aim for their heavily armored chests. She moved with ruthless, mechanical precision. Peefed. A suppressed subsonic round shattered the left guard's knee. As he collapsed, exposing the unarmored gap at his neck, she fired twice more. She pivoted. The second guard swung his weapon blindly toward her. Sarah stepped inside his guard, grabbing the hot barrel of his rifle and redirecting it upward. With her free hand, she drew her karambit and drove the curved blade up, under the rim of his ballistic helmet. He dropped like a stone. The stairwell fell dead silent again, save for the ringing in Sarah's ears and the heavy, mechanical hum of the bunker's air scrubbers. She stepped over the bodies. The keypad to the blast door had been destroyed in the firefight. The locking mechanism short-circuited and sparking. She gripped the heavy steel wheel, put her bloody boot against the wall for leverage, and pulled with the last ounce of her physical strength. With a groan of heavy hydraulics, the vault door swung open. Sarah stepped into the room. It was a luxury fallout shelter, paneled in fake mahogany and lined with monitors displaying the blacked-out, chaotic security feeds from the estate above. Sitting behind a massive steel desk in the center of the room was Colonel Elias Thorne. He didn't look like a master tactician anymore. His perfectly tailored uniform jacket was discarded on the floor. His tie was loosened. His hair was disheveled, plastered to his forehead with cold sweat. In his trembling right hand, he held a gold-plated 1911 pistol, pointed directly at the doorway. Sarah lowered her MPX, letting it hang from its sling. She didn't raise her hands. She just stared at him. "Stand down, Chief Vance," Thorne barked, his voice cracking, desperately trying to summon the authority he used to wield over her. "That is a direct order. Drop your weapon." Sarah took a slow, deliberate step into the room. Her dark, rain-soaked trench coat dripped onto the expensive Persian rug. Her eyes, shadowed by the brim of her cap, were hollow and dead. "You don't give orders anymore, Elias," she whispered, her voice rough like sandpaper. "Your army is dead. Your friends are dead. You're out of chess pieces." Thorne's hand shook violently. He gripped the pistol with both hands, aiming squarely at her chest. "I will shoot you. I will put you in the ground permanently this time. Sarah, don't take another step." Sarah didn't stop. She took another step, closing the distance. She was completely indifferent to the gun in his hand. She had died 18 months ago. A bullet couldn't scare a ghost. "Do it," she challenged softly. "Pull the trigger. Look me in the eye and do it yourself, instead of paying a proxy to do your dirty work." Thorne's finger trembled on the trigger, but he couldn't do it. The absolute, chilling lack of fear in her eyes paralyzed him. He was a man who traded in human lives on paper. From air-conditioned rooms thousands of miles away, confronted with the bloody, breathing reality of his sins, he was a coward. He lowered the gun slightly, swallowing hard. The bravado dissolved, replaced by a desperate, pathetic panic. "We can fix this," Thorne stammered, holding up his left hand in a placating gesture. You survived. You're here. That's a miracle. Sarah, you understand how the world works. It's a machine. I had to grease the wheels. Sterling needed that land, and the insurgents needed those weapons to keep the region destabilized. It was national security. It was treason, Sarah said, stopping just 3 feet from his desk. You sold American weapons to the enemy. And when I found the manifest, you fed Bravo team to them to cover your tracks. I can give you anything, Thorne pleaded, dropping the pistol onto the desk. He leaned forward, his eyes wide. I have access to offshore accounts. Millions, Sarah, tens of millions, untraceable. I can get you a new identity. A new passport. You can disappear to anywhere in the world. You can be a queen. Just let me walk. Sarah looked at him. She didn't feel rage anymore. She just felt an overwhelming, profound disgust. She reached into her coat pocket with her left hand. Thorne flinched, expecting a gun. Instead, she pulled out a small, black digital audio recorder. She pressed the red button and set it gently on the steel desk between them. I don't want your money, Elias, she said softly. I want your confession. Thorne stared at the blinking red light. If I confess, you'll let me live? Tell me why you did it. Tell me about the weapons in Ramadi. Tell me about the ambush. Say it out loud. Thorne looked at her, his mind racing, trying to find the angle. He thought she was negotiating. He thought she was holding out for leverage. All right, Thorne breathed heavily. He leaned toward the microphone. I diverted 3 shipments of AT-4s and M4 carbines from the Ramadi armory. I sold them to the local insurgent cells. When Chief Vance discovered the discrepancy, I provided the insurgents with Bravo team's extraction coordinates in Syria. I designated them as expendable to protect the pipeline deal with Richard Sterling. I ordered the hit. Thorne looked up, a sick, hopeful smile touching the corner of his lips. There, you have it, the insurance policy. You own me now. Sarah, we're business partners. Sarah reached forward and picked up the recorder. She pressed the stop button. We aren't partners, Sarah said. She reached into her tactical belt and drew the customized, suppressed Glock 19. It wasn't a sniper rifle. It wasn't a shot from a mile away. It was close, intimate, and unavoidable. Thorne's eyes went wide. The color drained completely from his face. Wait, you said. I said I wanted your confession. Sarah interrupted, raising the pistol level with his chest. I never said I offered a pardon. Sarah, please, he begged, raising his hands, tears finally spilling down his face. Please, I'm a decorated officer. I have a family. So did Leo, Sarah whispered. The image of the Syrian minaret flashed behind her eyes. The heat, the blood, the sound of the radio clicking off for the last time. She didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. Peeved. Colonel Elias Thorne was thrown backward against his leather chair. His head slumped forward, his eyes locked in an empty, permanent state of terror. The architect was dead. The list was complete. Sarah stood in the silence of the bunker for a long time. The adrenaline that had kept her moving for the last 48 hours suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a crushing, skeletal exhaustion. Her legs gave out. She slumped against the edge of the steel desk, sliding down to the floor. She pressed her hand against her bleeding side, her vision swimming at the edges. She pulled the tarnished, brass shell casing from her pocket, the last round she had fired in Syria. She looked at it, the metal cold and heavy in her palm. For the first time in 18 months, the voices of Miller, Jackson, and Leo were completely silent. The ghosts were gone. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness of the bunker wash over her. The rain in Washington, D.C., finally broke at 6 a.m. on a Thursday. The morning sun crested over the Potomac River, casting a brilliant, golden light across the white marble of the monuments. But the dawn brought no warmth to the halls of power. Instead, it brought a firestorm. At exactly 6:01 a.m., an encrypted email was simultaneously delivered to the inboxes of every major news anchor, investigative journalist, and international media outlet in the country. Attached to the email was the contents of Sarah's titanium flash drive, cross-referenced with the crystal-clear audio recording of Colonel Elias Thorne's dying confession. By 7 a.m., The world stopped turning. Every television screen in Times Square, every radio in every commuter's car, and every smartphone in the capital was playing the same chilling, cowardly voice. I provided the insurgents with Bravo team's extraction coordinates in Syria. I designated them as expendable to protect the pipeline deal. I ordered the hit. The fallout was apocalyptic. Wall Street panicked, and the stock for Apex Vanguard plummeted to zero in a matter of minutes. Federal marshals raided the Pentagon, dragging high-ranking officials out in handcuffs. The web of corruption had been torn wide open, and the men who thought they were untouchable were suddenly drowning in the daylight. 8:30 a.m. The Blackwood Estate. 40 miles away, the Blackwood Estate was a war zone. Dozens of black FBI SUVs and armored police vehicles choked the long, manicured driveway. Crime scene tape fluttered in the crisp morning breeze. Special Agent Caldwell stood on the stone patio, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face pale as he stared at the body of the CIA director. Detective Marcus Reed walked past him without saying a word. Reed descended the spiraling, blood-stained concrete stairs into the subterranean bunker. The heavy blast door was wide open. Inside, a team of forensics experts was bagging evidence. Colonel Elias Thorne was still sitting in his leather chair, a single, perfectly placed bullet hole in his chest. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. "Did you find her?" Reed asked a passing technician, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Find who, detective?" the tech replied, looking exhausted. "There's nobody else down here. Just the colonel and his guards." Reed stepped further into the room. He looked at the floor. There was a heavy, dark trail of blood leading away from the desk, pooling near the blast door, and then trailing up the stairs before disappearing completely into the dense Virginia forest. She had lost a massive amount of blood. Medically speaking, she shouldn't have made it past the tree line. But Reed knew better than to bet against a ghost. He walked over to Thorne's massive steel desk. Resting precisely in the center of the pristine green blotter, right where Sarah had recorded the confession, was a single, tarnished brass shell casing. It was an M24 sniper round. The casing was battered, scarred by desert sand, completely out of place in the sterile, billion-dollar bunker. Reed reached out and picked it up. He rolled the cold brass between his thumb and forefinger. He thought about the empty grave at Arlington. He thought about the widow in Alexandria. He thought about the agonizing, terrifying burden of carrying the dead on your shoulders. A small, quiet smile broke through the heavy lines on Reed's weary face. "Rest easy, Chief," Reed whispered to the empty room. He slipped the brass casing into his trench coat pocket, turned his back on the dead colonel, and walked back up into the morning light. 6 months later, the air tasted of sea salt and warm freedom. Thousands of miles away from the marble monuments and the suffocating political gravity of Washington, D.C., a small, weathered sailboat cut smoothly through the azure waters of the Caribbean Sea. The sun was beginning to set, melting into the horizon in a spectacular, burning canvas of violet, gold, and deep crimson. There were no sirens here. There were no encrypted radios, no gunshots, no ringing in the ears. There was only the rhythmic, peaceful lapping of the waves against the wooden hull. Sarah Vance sat at the tiller, her bare feet resting on the fiberglass deck. She wore a faded white linen shirt and loose canvas pants. The sleeves were rolled up, revealing the pale, jagged scar that ran along her left side, a permanent reminder of the price she had paid in the dark. Her hair had grown out, catching the warm, salty breeze. She looked different. The hollow, dead stare that had haunted her reflection in the water pump room was gone. Her eyes were clear, reflecting the vibrant colors of the setting sun. She reached her hand up to her neck. Resting against her collarbone, hung on a simple leather cord, were 3 silver dog tags. Leo, Miller, Jackson. For 18 months, their voices had screamed in her mind. They had begged her to run, begged her to fight, begged her to balance the ledger. They had kept her alive in a pitch-black hole in the Syrian desert. And they had guided her hand through the rain-soaked streets of the capital. Sarah closed her eyes and listened. She heard the wind filling the mainsheet. She heard the cry of a lone seabird circling overhead. She heard the steady, Calm beating of her own heart. Silence. Perfect. Beautiful. Absolute silence. The ledger was balanced. The truth was out. Maya and the boy were safe. Living in a house fully paid for. Completely unaware of the shadow that had watched over them. The architects of Operation Red Dust were dead or rotting in federal prison. Sarah opened her eyes and looked out at the endless expanse of the ocean. She took the 3 dog tags in her hand, the metal warm against her skin. She didn't throw them into the water. She didn't need to let them go. She finally understood that they weren't anchors weighing her down anymore. They were just memories of brothers she had loved. Men who had fought bravely and could finally, truly rest. Sarah adjusted the tiller, catching a new gust of wind that pushed the small boat faster toward the burning horizon. The United States Navy thought she was dead. The government thought she was a myth. Detective Reed thought she was a ghost. But as the last light of the sun dipped below the water, washing the world in a deep, peaceful twilight, Sarah Vance took a deep breath of the ocean air. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was just alive.